Welcome back, people, to another episode of the referential in the network. I hope you're as excited as I am to continue. So, last time we spoke quite a lot about all of these precursors that define the stage that I feel digital art is developing upon. And I think that's quite interesting because it's fascinating to look how all of these dimensions of individual endeavor kind of contribute to the conjoint venture that we would call a global scale of occurrence. So I think it's quite interesting for me looking at this context where micro becomes macro and macro goes back to micro. And I think kind of like it's quite interesting looking at the process from the side of the perimeters that have come to define it and the premises it exists upon. In many ways, there's this dimension where our existence and I almost said our reality. However, reality is a word or a term that I'm quite conflicted over. So I kind of prefer to use actuality, and I will get back to it a bit later on, but just bear with me. So it's interesting for me to look at the existence from the point where it has this inevitable circularity and the feedback loop that incessantly feeds into itself on one side, and on the other it exists on the premises of linear development defined by the arrow of time. And to me it becomes truly interesting looking at the premises that kind of go into all of this and kind of see the world from the point of manifestation, where what comes about is ultimately a culmination of the prospects that underpin it. And this might appear as a tautology in many ways, or quite given from the very onset. However, going back to this dimension of reality and actuality, to me it becomes truly interesting looking at the world from the point where reality is a term that within my scope of understanding carries within itself a one-dimensional compression of the existence and anchors such within a reified unit. And in many ways, this particular term also disregards all the premises that kind of underpin it and that have come to define it, while simultaneously holding claim that there is only one perceptual understanding of the parameters. And to me, it becomes quite unsavory to think about, exactly because of this claim of one dimensionality, it becomes superimposed into the apprehension and perception that, due to evolutionary development, appears as credible. So what I mean by that is that our senses have developed to hold a unified picture of the world in front of us so that we can navigate it from the point of further development. Whilst on the other side, our brain or like our mind and our body incessantly do a lot of approximations and calculations that define what we see as unified, as a one unit of reality. But the term itself disregards everything that kind of goes into defining such, and I find way importance or emphasis to be misplaced in that manner, as this dimension of existence is that kind of we perceive as reality. So what we perceive as something that has occurred and can be verified by simultaneous people operating within the scope and normal variation of common sense. But it becomes beautiful looking at it from the point where it becomes kind of interesting looking at it from the point where I prefer the term actuality. And one of the reasons is that actuality on its own is defined by the exchange, um, not only exchange, but is defined like puts emphasis on the premises that have come to define the situation. So when we say actuality, that already within its own terminology implies the complex network of interactions that underpin what we are seeing as presented. So to me, kind of a following everything from the point of its occurrence and kind of a looking alongside the linear trajectory where the premises become apparent, and in a sense we can see the actuality develop as the most plausible versions of everything that have of most plausible version of the parameters that have gone into defining a situation. So seeing actuality is, from my standing point, is heavily intertwined with plausibility and possibility of interaction. So kind of almost kind of comes down to math in many ways. And from that, in that manner, it becomes truly interesting for me looking at the manifestations as occurrences, or like at least these globules of meaning, where the emergence is defined by the parameters that kind of enter into the equation. And art in many ways is one of such things. So like we previously spoke about parameters and that define the present coordinates, such as digital revolution that is in many ways connected to art through the sake of language that has been applied to it. So and that very same language is language that is connected to metaphysical and philosophical investigations. So within the scope of existence, art becomes an interesting manifestation, I think, especially when it comes to the timing, because if we kind of go back to the early humanoids, Maslow's pyramid is being covered at the very bottom. So there is this level of self-sustenance anchored in shelter, food, accumulation, and proliferation or propagation of the species, and especially with the emphasis on the first two. And I'm not going to comment on the last, but it is quite interesting looking at it from the point where up to a certain moment in history, our species has been content and the evolutionary process has stopped within its own prospect, as it has done for many other species. So we're kind of like looking at the evolution on the global level. What becomes interesting is the question, why did certain species stop developing, or why did we as the only species developed as far as we have? And I think that's a very interesting and peculiar question that it's kind of good to ask. So within that context, art emerges as something truly fascinating. And it emerges as the first, as well, I choose to call it the first, I think it's a first branch where this multidimensionality of the evolutionary process and the existence itself becomes heavily connected with the expanding consciousness and apprehension of the parameters that define the existence. And that becomes an interesting space to explore, as up to a certain point, as we said, like the primal instinct was still reigning supreme when art started emerging. So as such, it becomes interesting to look at art and its emergence as a record of the respective cognitive development that we are inevitably a product of. And this dimension of causality becomes also quite interesting to observe. On one side, causality has not been foreign to early humanoids. Every point of existence that has the capacity to connect a hand with a form of a weapon or a tool that can aid in building a shelter or killing an animal or harvesting for that matter, um, is anchored within our minds on the premises of causality. However, art becomes quite interesting, exactly as for the first time in history, in human history, and the history of I'm not sure about the universe. I will skip that, but definitely in the first time on the premises of human history, we have a form of interaction that solicits creation within the scope where an agent capable of understanding dimensions of causality reaches out and picks up a medium with the capacity for transfer, um, where this capacity becomes a tool in a reiterated render that circumscribes the contents, understanding, and the aspect of reproduction quite early in the human history. And it's interesting again from the point of developing consciousness and how this dimension pans out exactly on the premises that we're speaking about. Um, because this dimension of transfer that occurs, so an agent recognizes something within its capacity to leave a mark and is in many ways ushered to employ such within the context of representational reiteration. So to me, it opens up this level of cognitive reverberation that rest upon new set of understanding of the qualitative dimension of exchange that human interaction resides on. And at the same time, I feel it kind of opens up a contemplative dimension where the pondering of the relationship between X, Y, and Z, or between all these different elements, become quite important for further development of the existence or of the apprehension. And in many ways, that is not something that we find within the scope of, for example, Hunt, where there is the need to examine the physical aspects within one's movement are certainly there. However, this cognitive development that kind of opens up for this contemplative approach is something that kind of starts falling outside the parameters that mere hunting or mere physical activity can allow for. Um, and it's kind of interesting, this dimension of exactly of a humanoid picking up a tool that has capacity to leave a mark, so it has capacity to leave a trace, and within the scope of linearity of the time that we exist within, this dimension of leaving trace becomes quite interesting, exactly because it leads to further development of the contemplative, the relationship that is the premises of our existence today. In many ways, this dimension of art and reiteration of within the scope of production also becomes quite interesting on the premises of knowledge, where in a sense it becomes knowledge encapsulated within movement, where the artist of the early humanoid adopts its own role within the kinetic system. It has a prompt into existence, I think. And this becomes a symbiotic relationship where the mediatory capacity of the joint movement establishes something that is very closely connected to proliferation of meaning and the emergence of meaning. So it's interesting to kind of look at it from that point, I think, like, or at least for me it is, where I feel this, not only this creative output, but yes, the creative output as branching of the evolutionary process that has not been available for any other species other than the early humanoids and us, descendants of that. And this dimension of reiteration and exchange and adoption through means of transfer, to me, it appears as if they're saying something truly fundamental about the process, I think. And the process is one of the most peculiar dimensions of this existence, and my fascination with such is quite unyielding in many ways. So it is kind of interesting looking at art kind of falling outside the Maslow's pyramid and the basic basic necessities that define the existence. So in a sense, art does not benefit anyone at a point of its inception. Art now falls within the evolutionary context where one can earn for living and live of art. But within its context of manifestation in the early stages, nothing of such sorts ever existed. And I think it's kind of interesting exactly where art becomes this peculiar extension of the cognitive process, which in many ways appears as quite unsolicited, other than anchored in potentially human boredom or human perception, where one can truly kind of start to understand that the energetical surplus that led to further development of the species has also kind of allowed for the process to branch out in unforeseen directions. And I mean, it's beautiful to think about it. It's so beautiful to think about it because it's so rare and so precious. I think I'm utterly mesmerized by, like, when it comes to art, this dimension of selective reiteration and like doubling of specific contents within the scope of human development, of human cognitive apprehension. It becomes, like, for me it is quite interesting exactly because it ties to so many different fields of interaction, where concepts such as memory, tracing, mimetics, recognition, subjectivity all fall under the umbrella of movement that defines art per se. And it's quite interesting from that point because, together with increasing consciousness about one's own coordinates, also within the context of covering the basic necessities, and with the art on top as this creative output that potentially came unsolicited, but it happened anyhow, becomes interesting to think about exactly within the scope of of this newly established relationship where self becomes the locus of agency, but what kind of pans out is connected to the layers we kind of previously spoke about. And this dimension of leaving a mark, leaving a trace, is ultimately also underpinned by the subjective parameter, by the individual and local parameters that define the situation such is occurring within. And again, this might sound as completely and quite devastatingly apparent, but this dimension of qualitative exchange between elements, especially the granularity the universe operates on, become truly peculiar exactly from the aspect of trying to understand the world we live in and attempting to account for it in the best means possible in order to transcend further. So art within this scope is truly interesting, exactly because it highlights this cognitive development that isn't solely contingent upon the Maslow's pyramid and has suggests other different, like other ways of existence. And I've kind of spoken a bit about, like I mentioned, the contemplative dimension, and I feel that it kind of exactly connects to what I'm speaking of. That as an agent picks up a medium with an intention to establish something or to create something, what we have is not solely longer a unit, a unit of subjective consciousness and knowledge, but what we have is a kinetics apparatus that moves in accordance to its own will and it dictates its own movement, rather than being coaxed into whatever. So I think it becomes truly interesting exactly because as this deposition occurs, a transfer of energy happens simultaneously with the prospects of leaving a trace. So that trace is in many ways codified by the exchange and transfer that happens upon the individual basis and individual premises and things like skill, but also one's own perception. So what art becomes within its early onset is this dimension where transfer that occurs isn't devoid of context. It cannot be devoid of context, and it cannot be devoid of qualitative dimension that defines any artwork in many ways. So it does kind of truly open up interesting questions, I feel, within the context of navigational, self-navigational scope of this within the universe. Exactly because these prospects of art are showing us that there is this dimension of exchange, energetical exchange, that happens upon the premises where every single line that has been put down has its own qualitative dimension and resonance tightly connected to it. So it's interesting kind of looking at it from the point of adoption of the qualitative within the transferring scope. So what I mean by that is that as one is starting to observe this relationship that emerges, individual apprehension starts playing a very big role in how artworks and a lot of different things are looked upon. So in many ways, this dimension of contextualization occurs already from the point of leaving one mark on the canvas or on the paper or whatever it may be. And it's kind of looking at the postmodernism and the waves surrounding both times before and after, exactly as this extension of a process where a process is ushering its own comment while simultaneously establishing aesthetics connected to it. And it kind of like looking at the evolutionary process as we have come until now, this exchange of parameters where individual apprehension is the one that steers manifestation. Like all of these readings that I've done and a lot of surfing of a lot of channels and all of these different podcasts, I've definitely put in some really interesting ideas in my head exactly from the point of the existence. So this entire dimension becomes truly interesting to me exactly from the point where the exchange that happens upon the premises of the qualitative contextualization and the granularity of human existence that shows itself as such. Sorry, I have my neck is hurting a bit for some reason, so I'm giving myself a nice massage. And what kind of this also does, I think it's one kind of falls into the process of qualitative self-apprehension and self-evaluation, where this act of depositing marks or creating something, and as we've seen, so The cave paintings range from very simple doodlings to actually quite complex, realistic representations of animals for the most part. So animals are and so most of the depiction of animals are like some of the depiction of animals are anchored in the realistic representation, where we can also see tracing and retracing of the human hand as it kind of like tries over and over again to capture that sentiment, or to connect and understand what is happening within the scope that we're kind of seeing. But I also think emergence of art becomes truly interesting within this contemplative dimension, exactly as it ushers and solicits its own further proliferation, where this reverberational character that one encounters as one ponders upon the mark and traces one has left leave one wondering on the nature of how this universe works and why does it work as such. Art becomes defined as this place where consciousness starts developing the capacity to recognize itself and recognize its own qualitative output based upon another premise that kind of outgrows the basics of the Maslow's pyramid. So art becomes this very weird space which explores constitutive parameters exactly upon the dimension where embodied content becomes like if one looks at any artwork, one can look at it an artwork as an art one can look at an artwork as a whole, or one can also look at the artwork as a table of contents. One can look at it as both and where embodied content becomes the place of meeting, and all of these different spheres that enter into artwork also enter into relationship with each other within the coordinated aspect. So this dimension of art where it exists upon the premises of expanding consciousness, where consciousness can observe itself outside the scope, as we have previously mentioned, of the most basic and primal needs, starts acquiring quite an interesting note and flavor, I think. And it also kind of starts placing art within a very interesting space where art becomes why do people doodle? Why do they doodle on the wall? Why do we do graffiti? Is it ornamental? Is it ideological? Is it ritualistic? I think all of those questions are quite interesting, and I think like art as a as a as a as a discipline becomes fascinating exactly as it places this dimension of kinetic structure within the context of subjective agency on top of the capacity to observe oneself, transfer the qualitative dimension upon something, and as such employ it within the context of fine-tuning oneself. And this would be a speculation. However, if one looks at the world that we exist upon, it exists exactly upon these premises. So art becomes this truly peculiar discipline where the branching of the process falls outside the initial need on one side, and on another side it becomes this and on other side it adopts this space where it becomes both ideological and ritualistic. And one of the reasons like why I mean it's ideological and ritual are kind of we can start with those, because a modulation of outcomes through apprehended subjectivity definitely point out to the fact that every outcome has its qualitative value. So, for example, Agnes Martin's lines stand kind of a central as a good example of what I'm trying to emphasize, where the lines that have been placed have all within themselves encoded this energetical dimension where no line, no matter how immaculately placed or done, will hold the same value as any other line. So, what becomes truly interesting within that context is exactly this dimension of qualitative exchange, where the qualitative becomes heavily entwined with the bodily movement, um, allowing for a kinetic structure to extend itself. And I think that's why art has always been a very close proximity to the ritualistic and to the mystified and to almost the occult in many ways. Exactly because on the premises where this idea of transfer starts playing a very interesting role. So, what is a ritual? And like it's a good question to start with, exactly because ritual is defined as a set of behavior patterns that are believed to induce a state or a form of a state. So one is kind of incessantly putting equal the sign of equality between the energy that has come to define the ritualistic in conjunction with the understanding of the reiteration itself. So it is kind of interesting speaking about all of these things because one kind of understands that there are not too many words one can employ within this context. So art as a ritual becomes truly fascinating exactly within the scope of the energetical transfer that occurs through means of reiteration. And in many ways, it's interesting to kind of look at art from the point of it existing both as a branch of the ritual as much as it is ritual itself. And I yes. And I think kind of this dimension exactly as we spoke of the ritual becomes also truly interesting because the idea of transfer where rather than kind of this idea of transfer becomes interesting exactly within the scope of understanding that underpins any form of choice making. And I think that's quite interesting and quite beautiful to look at. And naturally, we have art as ideology as well. I think I'm not sure to which degree this romanticized narrative of the suffering artist has a lot to do with this ideological dimension, especially a dimension that is heavily intertwined with obscene amounts of drinking sometimes, I have to say, because meeting people does take time and can be quite exhausting. So it becomes truly interesting kind of looking at it from the point where art becomes the carrier of the symbolic simultaneously as it ushers its own understanding through means of a medium, and medium being human in this context. So what I mean by that is that human is the one that solicits, while everything in between becomes a bonus. And kind of a that aside, it is quite interesting to look at it from the point where a recognition of the symbolic order emerges. The deeper one is defined by the categorical imperative in many ways that emerges from the proliferation of meaning. Because if the act of deposition is always entwined with the presented aspect and the symbolic order, what kind of pans out is inevitably creation of meaning and value. And I think it's quite interesting exactly from the point of development also of the human consciousness, where those that have put an effort of some or the other kind have eventually reached the state where things have kind of changed drastically, I feel. And the ideas of boundaries are potentially removed in many ways, but let's see how it happens. But kind of going back to the art as ideological, I think like art has, especially during and after postmodernism, has really taken a big jump into the metaphysical, where there are many dimensions of language that one can observe exactly connected to such. So learning for me, like how to move and write and whatever it may, is heavily connected exactly to this dimension of recognition of semiotics. So the sign signifier relationship that inevitably emerges as soon as the quantitative is represented. So this recognition of the symbolic order becomes interesting exactly as it falls under the categorical imperative and proliferation of meaning, together with its advancements. So um, it becomes quite interesting looking at the world from the premises where both the ideological and ritualistic are very heavily entwined with art. And that naturally leads to the question for what about art is ornamental? Like, how do we look at art from that point? And I personally do not mind in many, like in no matter what happens, I'm not very I'm not, I don't like my, yes. So ornamental becomes interesting to me exactly because it has received quite harsh critique within certain contexts. So if one looks at the exchange that happens upon the premises of understanding parameters, art as ornamental emerges from a peculiar point where what is being explored um, allows art to exist within the context of enhancement. And I think that enhancement becomes interesting exactly within the scope of the ornamental, because going back to the evolutionary process, no matter how uninteresting we might find it from time to time, there is very little dispute that the process moves on in accordance to its own beat of the drum. So looking at the process from this point where differentiation acquires both subjective and global, not solely tendencies, but also energies and whatnot, does create space for an interesting exploration, I think, where value comes to the front. And I know that a lot of people are challenged by ornamental art, and many people would call that commercial art. However, in many ways, that is very true. On the other side, there are definitely levels there that are that can be explored. But I think it's quite interesting that as soon as this existence kind of comes about, what we already have at hand is a discussion regarding the accumulated knowledge, where both like for example for me ornamental and so all of these parameters exist within different contexts. So art as ornament, as means of enhancing one's own space, isn't necessarily bound by human vanity, but it is bound by the human process, which does not allow for exploration outside its own existence. And it's also something that I'm very deeply enamored with, exactly as this dimension of change, embodiment, transfer are very tightly connected to a language that I personally enjoy, where the exchange that occurs isn't based solely upon the premises um, of the qualitative representation and the table of contents, but it's also entwined with the individual perception of how and what is and on which level it is. That in many ways, if one kind of look at it from the point of, for example, from the point of ornamental, the ideological and ritualistic, art becomes truly interesting because a lot of these things can overlap, but don't actually necessarily need to. Um, so art kind of becomes this truly interesting dimension where the prospects for its further branching lie suddenly upon a very vast field that is defined by the subjective apprehension. So whether one chooses to look at art as one of these elements that we're speaking about, or as one of the, or within the context of all three, becomes this matter of how individually we define coordinates of existence. And I like it. To me, art is quite beautiful. Exactly from its very onset to following it further down the line to where we are here. So, kind of within this triad, as previously mentioned, art falls within as a recognition of the symbolic order, recognition and adoption and adaptation of the symbolic order, where it creates a network that falls under this categorical imperative, where the succession of inputs has its own hierarchical structure. And within such context, with what we have is production and proliferation of meaning, I think. Making kind of this kinetic structure that involves the artist on one side and then the canvas or paper, whatever chosen interface is. Where this dimension of redefinition and reiteration also kind of stand close by, where what we have at hand is a very interesting relationship with the referential on one side, and on the other side one can kind of truly starts wondering about the elements and value that have kind of gone into developing concepts that we are very familiar with today. And what art becomes within that scope is a new discipline that exists as almost as a mediator between human development and our apprehension of the possibilities that such kind of a carries within. So that's what kind of I feel is one of the most exciting prospects about the emergence of art and its further proliferation is exactly this like unveiling of of symbolic, where semiotics kind of come forth within the recognition of the relational dimension that exists within amongst the characters. So it becomes truly fascinating looking at any forms of markings as a form of identity, I think. But that's naturally something that we will speak about later. But if we kind of look at art today, where it has developed and how it has developed, it's just truly marvelous. So what kind of happens within the context of the relational dimension is that the kinetic structure becomes heavily intertwined within the context of movement and the traces deposited, where iterations and time play also a major role. So I feel that if there is something interesting to discuss about art, it's exactly this form of encapsulation of the process and then the potential prerequisite dimensions of cognitive differentiation that have allowed for such to take place. And kind of going back to this dimension of ritual, art becomes art definitely bears traces of itself being in a ritual, where the qualitative imprint is directly connected to the movement employed. So it kind of it just becomes truly fascinating, the entire scope, where almost we're kind of going to speak a bit. I'm going to give you a bit of a preview. So next time we're going to speak about Walter Benjamin and aura. But what becomes quite interesting is exactly the summoning practice within the scope of art. So art is truly peculiar exactly because it does not emerge in a vacuum. And in many ways, I have often wondered, what does it make an artist and why did I branch into art? And I think there are very few fields on this planet that are currently allowing one to explore the relationship between elements in the way that as I have presented it. I do hope that you are liking this episode, and I hope you will stay on the line as we speak more about the process and prospects of aura and its existence. Because if one kind of look at art from the point of emergence, it becomes quite evident that um, that everything that kind of comes about is inevitably tied to navigational prospects of an individual level, where the assembly of elements, seemingly haphazard or deposited in which manner one wishes, are there to still enhance parts of our lives. So one can kind of look at the evolutionary process as the process of incessant redefinition and perpetual enhancement. And I think that is what makes art so interesting and so beautiful. Exactly this exchange between timing, place, etc., that allows for different things to emerge within their own prospects. And I think at this point, I will leave you with this, and then we'll speak soon.